Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's Friday night, and you guys are coming to an architecture talk. I'm very impressed. 2 drink tickets. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've never been to Raleigh before. The workshop sounds fantastic. I love the setup that In Situ has kind of instigated here. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Zach, and everyone at In Situ for inviting me to present some work today. And what I want to show today, it's sort of it's not your typical architecture lecture. Actually, you guys had some architects come that showed buildings and real things in the world. I'm going to be showing, partly because we're a young office, ideas about buildings. Hopefully, if I come back in 5 years, we'll have more physical things built to show you. But it's been really important for me to structure questions around agency. What is the agency of the designer today, especially given the world that we're confronting? And I think it's something I've noticed teaching. I've been teaching for 15 years and just seeing students craving more and more agency for the discipline, asking questions of what does this all mean, and can the discipline do more than service the top 1% of wealth in the world? How do we actually think about these skills being distributed? And so today I want to speak about collective form, and I think for me this is a really important topic because I think all the challenges we face as a society to be addressed need us to come together. And I think this is a particularly important moment to discuss this because more and more people are living in what we could call precarity. This refers to not having access to a stable income, job, and support systems. And in fact, the pandemic has actually forced many more people to live in precarity. There's a name for this. This is an emerging class called the precariat. In America, it's estimated that 30% of people live like this. In many countries, it's getting closer to 40–50% of people living in some form of precarity. And precarity isn't just about money, it's also all the other effects that happen when you don't have access to certain forms of stability. These are both emotional and psychological effects as well as real tangible effects about putting, food on the table and so forth. And I think this moment of seeing how many people are living precarious at the same time with how much wealth is being aggregated in very few areas in the world makes me really wonder where the discipline might have a role. And in fact, a lot of the things that come to when you really dig down to the core of precarity are the questions around labor, which obviously our discipline doesn't affect, although we as our own discipline actually are guilty of fostering and instituting a lot of precarious labor and unpaid labor, but also access to housing. This is a huge part of what makes people live in precarity. At the same time, the pandemic has really reminded us of the vulnerabilities of our society, the lack of nimble infrastructures, the redefinition of what we might call essential work, the complexity of dealing with global issues that also need to confront local differences and nuances. And if the pandemic was a training run for us to think about how to deal with issues like climate change, it really foregrounds the need for collectivity and a collective response. And I think this, was a moment where we're literally in it together. Like if you turn on the news these days, every single news article is about climate change. It's not, foregrounded as that. It's a drought here, a flood here, heat waves there, but it's really climate change. And climate change isn't abstract and in the distance. It's actually, right here at our doorstep. And I'm reminded of this moment in the 1960s where Stuart Brand, who started the Whole Earth Catalog, went on this campaign distributing, this is an early form of a blog, a pin with a statement on it saying, why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth yet? And he was really making a push to NASA to release these photographs because they hadn't been released after they had been taken for almost a year. And I think that photograph that's on the cover of the Whole Earth Catalog, which was also the home screen of many of your iPhones, your first iPhones, was a really integral photograph for people to see themselves as part of a larger collective structure and remind ourselves of what we share in common. So I would like to propose that we expand the subject of design to include a pluralistic collective as well as the natural environments that we inhabit. And both of these subjects are evolving, contingent, and time-based, whereas the discipline of architecture has traditionally dealt with determinacy, permanence, form, with the role of the architect being to determine these lines that ordered both the natural and social world. And this disciplinary need to control nature we know is futile. We're seeing it on the news every day with things crumbling that we've tried to control. And also with the rise and embrace of pluralism and diversity being at the core of the public sphere, we see that the subject of design is also expanding. No longer the masses, architecture is now confronted with divergent subjects and their individual values that are often irreconcilable or controllable. And so I think this sets up a real disciplinary conundrum. How do you actually take a discipline that thrives in ordering the world and providing kind of stability and permanence to a world that is no longer about order and stability and permanence, and it's evolving, contingent, and I think many things have evolved with time, but our medium is literally the last thing that can't be despatialized, except for all the AI technologies we're seeing, and Zoom and so forth. We're seeing space is space; it's physical. And so I've really been taken by a theoretical construct by Umberto Eco. This was his PhD dissertation that was called The Open Work, to seek out a template for how a designer might be able to design with confidence and determinism while still allowing for the possibility of conflicting values and things that can't be controlled. If you haven't read Eco's treatise, I'll try to sum it up in 2 slides very quickly, and he's going to be rolling in his grave with my summary here. Eco's book essentially goes through a range of art practice, and he shows this kind of historic moment where artwork went from being closed to open. And the way he defined a closed work of art was where the relationship between the subject, who would be the viewer of the art, the object, the piece of art itself, and the author was crafted by the author. So the success of that piece of art was that the subject understood the object exactly the way the author intended them to. And if they understood it in any other way, it wasn't considered successful. So this is really kind of a translation. And Eco shows that during the Baroque period and following, there was various forms of art, from poetry, writing, painting, that started to have a degree of openness, where the author purposely actually left certain things unplanned and open for the subject to fill in and complete the work itself. So the subject is no longer a passive person, but they're actually an active agent in completing the work. And what's, for me, really important with Eco's kind of idea is that the artist doesn't lose agency in that translation. They're not giving up all agency to the subject. There's still a world intended by the author, which is the work, but there's an openness to that work. And I think this project of his, could open up conversations about how do we design things that, really react to a diverse public. How do we design things to also maybe account for the natural environment? Now, in Eco's treatise, he doesn't talk about architecture. It's left out of the conversation. But if we were to expand his topic into architecture, we would need to add an additional variable to the idea of the object, the subject, and the viewer, which would be the environmental context or the site, which of course every architectural project is rooted in. And I would say that if you did that, this could actually provide a template to deal with environmental and political indeterminacy. And so all the work I show tonight they're all kind of tests of different ideas of what an open work might be in architecture. Now, the title of tonight's talk, New Investigations in Collective Form, is in reference to this text by Fumihiko Maki from 1964, Investigations in Collective Form. And in Maki's text, this is just an excerpt from the text, he says, of course, the progenitors of any formal idea include politics and economics. The reason, in fact, for searching for new formal concepts in contemporary cities lies in the magnitude of relatively recent change of those very problems. Our urban society is characterized by coexistence and conflict of amazingly heterogeneous institutions and individuals, essentially pluralism, unprecedented, rapid, and extensive transformations in the physical structure of society, rapid communication methods, and technological progress and its impact upon regional cultures. And in some ways, this text, which is from 1964, we still struggle with these same issues today. In Maki's treatise, he puts forward 3 types of collective form: compositional form, megaform, and group form. And if you're interested to know more about these, I can send you the text. I won't get into his typologies for sake of time. But let's say that we really took we took Maki's text to heart and asked ourselves, looking at our own work, what are the type of strategies that we've been employing in our work that could build upon Maki's 3 techniques? And we saw our work kind of going into these different directions of rewiring states, living archives, articulated surfaces, frameworks, and commenting. Some of these ideas are more time-based, some are more form-based, and some are more program-based. And so tonight I'll actually go through these 5 themes, present the theme, and then present a project that kind of embodies that theme. And I won't present them equally. Actually, the first 2 projects I'll go through pretty quickly, just so we can spend some time with some of the later projects I show. So the first thematics is what I'm calling frameworks. These are projects that typically operate between a negotiation of a legible geometric primitive and a flexible field condition. And these structures are brought to life through framing and indexing impermanent and ephemeral subjects, whether that's people or the natural environment. They often operate in the background and focus on framing the subject and recontextualizing them while producing a way to gather the collective and giving that collective a space for them to take charge of, reappropriate, and make their own. So the first project I'll show is actually an exhibition that was entitled New Investigations in Collective Form that was cited within actually a building by Fumihiko Maki, designed not during the 1960s, but during his postmodern phase in the 80s. So not as cool as some of his early projects. This was an exhibition where the curators asked us to reflect on our work, and this is where we went through this exercise of trying to understand these themes. And our design for this gallery was to create this field condition that's centered on these 5 larger hubs, which were each tied to these themes. And each of these modules essentially contained different projects that were tied to those themes. And these modules were all hanging from the ceiling in a cable pulley system, and they were interconnected. So essentially, a push and pull on one module caused an effect on others. And for us, it was in some ways a way to play out politics, that politics at its core is how the individual negotiates the collective, and we see that negotiation happening through all of our work. We also added plants into the mix, and because the exhibition run was 6 months, these plants actually grew during the exhibition, and their weight would also change these modules as well. So in this way, people, design work, and nature are connected into a system wherein this push and pull of the individual has some sort of feedback onto the collective. And this was one of the first images we produced to show the curators, what we wanted to do. It's a worm's eye perspective of showing this very ordered field condition, while in reality, when we hung it, nothing hangs like that. Everything took its own axes. And for us, that was also quite important, that there's always this discrepancy between the techniques and the tools that we draw with as architects that visualize the world in a form of order, and that space of allowing for things to fall where they fall and being okay with that. Subjects, because they can move these modules, can configure their relationship to the content. Some of these models, in fact, were underneath, some were on top. And the subject actually becomes part of the work itself through adding their weight to the system, and by doing so, changes the datum by which they also take in the work. In some ways, the exhibition also asks, sorry about the noise. The exhibition is like a performance of collectivity, or if you think about the idea of, like Hannah Arendt's idea of power, is that power is formed by people working and acting together. And in the exhibition, some of these larger models can be moved, but you can't move them just by moving one adjacent module. You need to get 2 or 3 people together to move them together. And so this really became for us a kind of exercise in forcing or putting forward what it means to work together with people. Following the exhibition, we put together a book that we thought would actually be able to dig deeper into these themes and we kept the exhibition fairly open for a diverse audience with very little wall text. In fact, it was very open for interpretation, whereas in the book, we really tried to situate these 5 discourses and also invited some others to reflect on these themes. So the second category is what I'm calling living archives. This is a thematic that really examines how collectivity isn't something that just exists here today between us, but also exists between generations. It's what we inherit and what we also choose to pass down to future generations. The archive is a very important, sorry, I think this might have been a little overzealous with taping down that cable. Let's see if that's, sorry, one second. So the archive's a very fascinating building type because it's really where we decide what lineages of history we hold on to and which ones we dispose of, which is questions about who's in power at any given time, but also the way the content's taken in, we classify that information. And through that knowledge construct of how we classify information, it changes the way that we understand and structure the world that we live in. And finally, through preservation, these forms of information are revealed through the value of a particular society. These really become sites for the exercise of political power. Archives are really a key technology of rule and have always been. And while they're cloaked as neutral repositories, I'm sure most of you think of archives as like dusty old rooms that just are holding stuff. These are really the assembling of information within archives has never been innocent. It always reflected how society structured their world and acted within it. And so going beyond the archive as a static container of information and transitioning it from a site of power to empowerment, the Living Archive project situates the archive as a place of discourse and public assembly. And so these projects, by doing so, these really foreground the public sphere and allow the kind of reordering of information to construct new histories and knowledge, inserting the subject into the assembly of the information, which allows us to really question, critique this information in the first place, i.e. understanding that that information is not stable, but it's something that always needs to be problematized. And I think this is something that was said earlier, that the students in this workshop are not problem solving, but you're probably problematizing the issue at hand. And I think that's where some of these projects are going with these in this kind of vein. So this is a project for a temporary garden pavilion in Canada. And I'm from Canada originally, and what I found really interesting when we started this project, we started looking at invasive species, essentially species that were brought into the country mostly for gardens for ornamental reasons and now have kind of taken over different landscapes. And in Canada, there's 486 of these species, and many of these were introduced during the colonization period of the 1800s. And ironically, it's the success of their flourishing that makes them now a problem. And many of these species actually were brought into Canada before Canada's own formation in 1867. So you could say some of these plants are actually more Canadian than Canada itself. And so we wanted to play with that, this question about what does this mean? And so we assembled a living archive of 22 of the earliest invasive plant species to Canada that were intentionally introduced for their beauty. And we proposed that for this garden festival that each plant would be within a tensile structure. So essentially there's a plant sitting within that structure. And again, and this is where some of this project came before the exhibition. The idea for this project, because the festival was something like 6 months, was that these plants are going to grow throughout the festival. And as they grow, their weight is going to pull that structure down closer to the ground, essentially heightening the tension of those roots potentially touching ground or seed pods potentially touching down. And so this is the one thing that we wanted to heighten, is that these species themselves are put into tension with the landscape around them. So just an image of what it would be like maybe at the start of the festival when these species are calibrated to be in similar weight, and of course as they grow and develop at different speeds, have different water retention, these modules and the portico itself would be distorted, but the subject of the natural environment gets indexed in that distortion itself. So in some ways we start giving a voice to the natural environment through the structure. This is just a planting plan that arranges these species as a timeline along the portico. And essentially we're trying to kind of produce this installation that tries to merge this kind of art garden installation with questions around ecology and politics. Users can push and pull on these modules as well as learn about characteristics of these plants such as growth rate or water absorption directly through the structure through time. And we're trying to frame this kind of idea between what's considered invasive and what's considered indigenous. I think, given the ongoing conversations around reparations, land ownership, continuous xenophobia in the world, this project uses nature as a substrate for a larger political conversation around, what comes first and what do we consider indigenous. So the third approach, and so those projects, I kind of blew through them really quickly just to keep things moving. But this third approach, and I'll kind of slow down now in the next three projects, is what I've called rewiring states. These are essentially projects that put architectural form in relationship to various states of time, temperature, materiality, as well as processes such as logistical processes and infrastructural processes. They attempt to rewire these processes through leveraging how architecture can adapt, transform, and impact territorial organizations and add new sociopolitical actors to these systems. As such, these projects typically look at the formal orchestration of form through time itself, and they attempt to challenge the traditional idea of a master plan through considering logistical states. So the project I'll show in this category is a project for Toledo, Ohio, which, is anyone from Toledo, Ohio by chance? I guess not. You can speak openly about Toledo, Ohio. Toledo, Ohio, it looks very innocent on this image, but in fact, Toledo, Ohio, and the Maumee River that borders along downtown Toledo has a huge amount of shipping that goes through it. It's a very productive space. So in places where I'm coming from, San Francisco, the waterfront doesn't have industry anymore. It's all been gentrified, high-end condos. In Toledo, it's still a very productive landscape along the river's edge. And because of that production, there's dredging that needs to happen, essentially the kind of emptying out of the river, the sediment at the bottom of the river to allow large ships to pass. And so there's 1 million tons of dredge material that are removed from the Great Lakes every year, and a third of this is just in that river itself. So this is a huge pinch point for sediment accrual. And one thing that you might not know is that dredging begets more dredging. So as you dredge a river, it actually accelerates erosion. So dredging is never a one-time thing and you're done. It's a continuous thing. So every year there's 1 million cubic tons of this material that's produced. And so this project, or this competition I should say, was set up to ask three things. What to do with all this material, because there's just so much of it every year. How it could do, and ask how it could do more for the city, to reconsider the stormwater management of the city that was under question at the time, and to find ways to cohabit the riverfront with this industry. And in fact, if you read between the lines of the competition, it was very clear they wanted, again, to use the architectural discipline to create commodifiable images of how to gentrify the waterfront, and through doing so, attract investors. But in fact, that was kind of a dream because it was a very productive port, and it's tied to the livelihood of many of the people that live there. And one of the first things that we found noticeable was that just the disconnection between where all this material is being dumped, which is right here at the mouth of the river, and the city itself. And because there is this kind of depravity of public space in the city, we wanted to ask, is there a different way that this material could be dumped that's more sustainable environmentally, but also provide for a more nimble programming of public space in the city? So through our research, we found these things called geotubes, which are essentially often used for breakwaters, as well as things like this, dredging. And essentially what we're proposing here is a series of islands made of these geotubes that are dealing with this dredge material to create public space in close proximity to the city. And so I'll walk you through how this works, and these circle diagrams are kind of looking at logistical states in time. So as you see them, they're kind of almost like a coding of the process. And that on the right here is just an image of what these geotubes look like. They're not high design. These are things you can buy like on the internet. They're like rubber. They unzip and so forth. So the first process would be, they pull the sediment out from the bottom of the river, which is essentially a slurry, and it's pumped into these geotubes, and these are tied together essentially to create a raft as a module. And then it needs to sit in dewater. Essentially, like the slurry needs to turn more into sediment, and that process takes a series of months. In fact, it takes 6 months. And during that time, we propose that very light public infrastructures are inserted on top of the geotubes to allow for an occupation of these islands, essentially, allowing residents to have access to the water, because right now they really have very little access to the water. Most of the water is colonized by this industrial infrastructure. So in this image here, while people are on this kind of platform above, in fact, there's an industrial process happening below of dewatering. And these are some of the islands we envision, but in fact, any island type could be made and accommodated for by the city based on the time of year, the residents' wishes. This is to say they're not precious. I think there's something like 300 islands that would need to be deployed over the course of the year. Every elementary school could have one. People could apply for them. It's really setting up a process that allows other people into that process and allowing them to design their own needs. And because it's an iterative form of urbanism, these islands only last for 6 months for public occupation. They act as a test, right? If something really works, you could bring it back again, but if it doesn't work, you don't need to. And I think this is kind of a way that as architects, it might take the pressure off making decisions that need to be in perpetuity for society. Once this dewatering stage is complete, the tubes are opened, and essentially you have sediment, but the sediment is contaminated. And so we hydroseed the soil, which is basically spraying, like almost with a fire hose, seeds into the soil, allowing for essentially phytoremediation, these plants to remediate that soil. And that process takes 3 months. And because of the amount of dredge, scheduling the dredge, dewatering public programs, and planting is critical. As new islands are dispatched every month, new programs can be accommodated for based on seasonal events and so forth. So they're really trying to think about how does a bottom-up approach, a tactical approach, align, and an iterative approach align with something that is more top-down and works within this kind of geologics of dredge. So what you get here is these islands in closer proximity to the city where they can be public amenities. And as opposed to a linear waterfront, which is what the city was looking for and we thought was untenable, could there be a different form of waterfront that's more polynuclear? Now, of course, one of the difficulties is how do you access these islands because of the ownership of the land through these industrial areas. And we actually looked at where all the culverts were in the cities that were draining into the river and proposed that those areas of culverts are converted into public easements so that some of that water that's streaming in from the city could actually go to those wetlands. Those floating islands in their wetland state could remediate that water as well before discharging it. And so this is just an image here of plan and section showing access points into those islands. Now, a part of the project that doesn't deal with dredge directly was just questions around the stormwater in the cities. This was like a side problem that they threw into the competition. And I don't know how the stormwater is set up in Raleigh. In Toledo, like many American cities, you have combined sewer overflow. So essentially when there's a large flood event, the pipes cross, and so sewage pipes expel into the water. And this is what they were trying to get rid of. You might also know that the contamination of water has to do with the length of travel from that raindrop, from when it first hits the ground to where it eventually gets, whether it's a water treatment plant or a body of water. So if you can reduce that length of travel for that raindrop, you actually reduce the amount of contamination that's being moved around in the urban landscape. And so we actually proposed, this is a project that's 5-6 years old now. At the time, it might be even worse through COVID. There was 1,100 or 1,124 foreclosed homes that were just waiting lands, right? These were homes that were abandoned and, not abandoned, that's not the right word to use. People were forced out of. And we proposed that these lots actually get cordoned off with sandbags of the remediated dredge around the house and around the lot itself to allow for a distributed form of like a micro lake, a micro series of detention basins, so that you take a big problem and you don't centralize, you don't move all that water to pipes and then eventually to a water treatment plant, but you allow it to collect on site closer to the source and percolate back into the landscape. Strangely, the 3 parks that they provided in the competition to deal with the water were around the same size, actually smaller than all these sites combined. So we actually had more area, but more distributed area. And this is something that I think, in the world of infrastructural design, they're talking about a lot, soft distributed systems that can be more nimble, because failure in those types of systems is not catastrophic. So if one of those sandbags bursts and one lot flooded its water, you don't have like a dam failure, right? It's and the kind of investment on it's also distributed. Different people would kind of just manage different lots. There were some year-round things. The river does freeze through the winter, so this area, this access point, is one of the bigger, more monumental structures on the site that allows for the dredging to occur year-round. Now, one of the things that wasn't asked for in the competition, but we couldn't not look at was, when you looked at Lake Erie, it was like, what's all that green goo coming out of Toledo? And as we looked further into this, in fact, it's algae growth. And this is actually caused by both fertilizer runoff as well as open water dredge dumping. And what happens with this algae growth, which is actually an invasive species, is that it grows along the surface and it suppresses the light penetration. So it essentially kills everything below it. And so we started looking into how could you actually deal with this. And one of the ways you can deal with algae is through bentonite, essentially clay, which acts as a natural absorber of the algae. So we proposed that after this dredge material, going back to the dredge, we're in the geotubes, it's been remediated for 3 months with the plants. Those plants are then pulled out. You have clean sediment, and at this point, you could either use that sediment in construction, you could use it for shoreline reclamation, or you can put it back into the water system because it's clean. And so we propose that it's turned back into a slurry with fresh water, mixed with bentonite, and taken out to different parts of the lake and essentially exhausted. And so this was a long process, but you have something like 300 islands every year that's being produced. So in time, you could actually, working with obviously ecologists and ecological engineers, kind of return the lake to its natural kind of presence. Now, this is the master plan, and it's a very unsatisfying drawing compared to the logistical states, and it really maybe asks the questions about the tools that we draw with as designers and their limits. When you're talking about things that are temporary or in complex systemic relationships, it's very difficult for something like a master plan to pull it all together. And this is a drawing of our logistical states and essentially the different ways that those scenarios could play themselves out. And for us, this framework is more important because it allows for kind of an openness of actors, socio-political actors in the system, but also an openness of how things might play out. There might be years where there's more dredging and years where there's less dredging and so forth. Now, I'm not going to say that this works everywhere or should work everywhere, but I think in the context of mid-sized cities such as Toledo, where you have a collision of low land value, productive industry along the water, and an associated depravity of public space, the system of producing land in a malleable, temporal, transformable logic can produce this symbiosis between a waterfront of industry, culture, and ecology. And this positions land not as a commodity to capture and hold, but rather as a temporal material state that is iteratively deployed and used by local constituents and then redistributed back into this territorial ecology. And I think for us, this idea of linking an industrial system to questions around cultural and social and ecological systems is to find these opportunities to empower new subjects within what was once this kind of top-down system of global capital that was quite disconnected from the public realm. So, 2 more projects. This is the 4th topic. It's called Commoning. And the Commons was, and still is, a system by which communities manage and share resources, cultural and natural, with minimal reliance on the state, and where there's typically equal stake in that interest. And these were really used in agrarian societies originally for managing land resources. And I think one of the most important things in a commons is the relationship between the resource and its user through these user-managed governance systems. And so the commons are not abstract. This, in fact, many theorists think that we need to actually eradicate the notion of public space, because what we call as public space as architects is not very public. It's steeped within surveillance and ideas of power and race and privilege. And public for who is the question that comes up a lot with public space. And in fact, to move more back to systems of commons where people have more agency on these spaces to control the spaces themselves. And I think that's the importance of us looking at this today, that valuing space through its use value and how it's maintained and the kind of bonds that are required to negotiate that will actually empower people, because I think what most people feel disempowered by is feeling disconnected from the scale of economics and the scale of government and institutions at the top and how to affect those right now. And so I think for us, we've really been interested in these kind of questions around the commons at the scale of territorial projects, but also at the scale of the negotiation of a few people. So I think, many of you have probably had roommates, and there might be fights about who didn't clean the dishes and so forth. That micro negotiation is the politics of every day, right? And so much of this research in the commons, there's kind of two strains of it. One looking at kind of larger scale projects like what I presented in Toledo, but another strain that's looking at the domestic commons, like the commons at home itself. And so I'll show the domestic scale today just to show a range of scales of work that we're working on. And this was a project that we recently exhibited at the Venice Biennial. And we really tried to ask this question of how do people negotiate everyday politics and find solidarity in the face of precarity. And of course, where I'm situated in the Bay Area, there's a legacy of this. In the 1960s and 70s, the Bay Area and Northern California saw hundreds of communes which were really rooted in this idea of the rejection of commercialism and the idea of rooted in shared property, shared labor, and experimentation with alternative family structures. And it's interesting that that movement, again, from the 1960s, we're many years away from it, we're still struggling to answer those questions today. How do we accept through our housing stock alternative family structures and non-nuclear families? How do we go beyond private property, which we know is at the root of much of the inequality in America right now? And how do we think about more shared forms of labor? And so these communities actually, while we might look back and write them off as just like hippies doing drugs, they're actually really fascinating experimentation of society that's going on here, which provided much more agency to people's way of life. And today, partly due to the housing crisis in the Bay Area and partly due to kind of fatigue with how society's working, there's a resurgence in collective living. In fact, some estimates show that there's just as many collective living projects, and I'm not using the word communes because I think there's a bigger range of what we consider collective living today in the Bay Area. And so this could be co-housing, cooperatives, communes, co-living. There's kind of a range, let's say, of techniques. In the Bay Area, one of the trends of adding affordable housing has been to create the micro unit, which is essentially the attempt to, squeeze everything of the nuclear unit to its most minimal size, to the point that, you might be like, in your shower with, 1 foot outside, or or when you need to have someone over for a dinner party, you need to put your bed away, and in some ways we're trying to ask, at what point is it just dysfunctional to hold on to the autonomy of the unit and the privacy that comes with it? What does it mean to start pulling stuff out of this unit and sharing it to give a higher quality of life for people and a more humane and, say, socially enriching way of living? So we're really trying to look at approaches that counter the micro unit by pulling things out and sharing them to gain, say, a larger access of amenities. And we're calling these luxuries without economic burden. So, if you're willing to share a bathroom, that bathroom can't just be the same bathroom you had in your room. It's got to have a hot tub and a sauna, right? That's the trade-off, right? If you're going to relinquish some privacy, is that you need to get something more back. And that's what becomes fascinating in many of the projects that we're looking at, is there is a more factor that's provided, a higher quality of life that's provided. So this project is both a research and design project, and I'm going to talk about the research at first. The research is really case study driven. We've been working with a lot of communities, literally measuring their space, asking very intimate questions about how they govern their labor and their household, deal with economics, to just learn what works and what doesn't seem to work in these types of living conditions, and trying to, say, pinpoint more clearly what are the potential pitfalls, because I think there's not that much discourse about what went wrong in all the experimentation in the 60s and 70s, and why that discourse faded so quickly with almost very little trace of it. Our analysis of case studies goes through 3 categories: hardware, software, and orgware. Hardware is probably the most, say, comfortable thing for architects to know. It's the physical form of the building and essentially how the public and the private realm are arranged within the building. So what's shown with blue walls are shared spaces, and anything shown in gray wall are areas that are considered private. And privacy doesn't always align with walls in many of these things. It might just be your bed, that's the private space. The second lens is software, and so this is just some of the case studies. So we're literally going into these places and measuring them and figuring out how they arrange their lives. And the second lens of software, we're really looking at how sharing manifests in these projects. So in some projects, you might share a bedroom with 2 people, you might share a bathroom with 5 people, you might share a living room with 10, and a kitchen with 20. In other projects, you leave your private realm, maybe it's your bedroom, and everything is shared by everyone in the community. And the way that that sharing operates and the kind of scales and tiers of that sharing actually play a role in how collectivity is formed, particularly in how sub-collectives are formed, and how people feel agency over their space. There's an intimacy to knowing someone's toothbrush and their bathroom routine in the morning that comes when you share a bathroom with 5 people. In some cases, this sharing also goes beyond the building itself. In this case study here, the Haight Street Commons, where you have several communes, this is a contemporary case study, you have several communes within close walking distance, they actually share many things that exceed the building. So they share cars, speakers, kayaks, things that you don't need as frequently get shared in this kind of bigger system or a network that starts emerging. And finally, the third axis is what we're calling orgware, and this is really the governance structures of how people live. And I think everyone can relate to this. Everyone has their right way of how this is done, and there's tensions. I've heard even divorces that manifest from these really difficult questions, right? And I love this plaque. This is actually from one of our case studies. The choice is yours, right, at the bottom, that this is always the question about agency and choice within living together, because that choice always needs to be negotiated when you're living with people. And so on one hand, you could say that living together requires patience, sacrifice, and compromise. On the other hand, it enables one as an individual and collective to define a way of living that more precisely reflects their values and can challenge the status quo produced by the market. And it's really the agency afforded to these inhabitants that allow them kind of paradoxically to require protocols of governance, because you need to manage that. And that's actually one of the biggest differences we see between the 1960s and 70s communes and now, is much more self-awareness that governance is key, that it can't just be countercultural and all rules suck, but actually it's about the type of rules and how those rules are formed and can potentially evolve. So just quickly here, this is one governance system, a duocracy, which is you can do whatever you want as long as it's reversible. You don't need to ask permission. On the far right is an assistocracy. This is what we're seeing in a lot of new co-living places that are set up for young tech workers, where it's technically co-living, but there's a company that deals with outsourcing a lot of things like the labor, grocery deliveries, and so forth. So one of the say tentacles of this research has been questioning policy in San Francisco and using this research to create more humane policy. The city of San Francisco, and we've been collaborating with them for now 3 years, is starting to see more projects that are deemed co-living, which fall under a term called group housing in the code. And it's a very nimble definition that was made many years ago, and essentially developers are taking advantage of this. So this is a project by Gensler and a developer called Forge that was put forward to the Planning Commission in San Francisco last year in the fall for 400 people with one shared kitchen. Many of these new projects are averaging between 8 and 12% shared space. And you can see, after the marketing of sharing and the altruism of community, what's really happening here is really instituting difficult, inhumane conditions that are almost like SROs. And so we use these case studies in our research to both extract quantitative data of how areas break down in functioning communities that have, and I still don't know what I would call a successful community, but one lens has been a community that just persists and can kind of evolve. And then also interviews and surveys with communities to try to understand what are the kind of aspects that make living together work. And we use this research to put together a large-scale report, like a white paper report, which we presented to the Planning Commission with a working with the San Francisco Planning Department, their lawyers as well, to change the definition of group housing, to institute, in fact, that any project that goes up for group housing needs a minimum of 33% shared space, which came from the case studies itself. Some of our case studies went as high as 50. Some of them, were lower, like closer to 20. So 33 was a number that we all felt comfortable with, was a doable number. That cuts across the range from cooperatives to co-housing, co-living, and so forth. And we were very lucky to get this approved. It went through multiple hurdles, and now is the law in San Francisco as of 2 years ago. The other strain of this kind of work is into the design world and thinking about what would future-oriented communities look like potentially, and how might they be organized. And I think this was pretty important for me because so much of the research that we did on those case studies, these are communities that don't have much money, so they're not building ground-up projects. They're often like getting a warehouse or an old Victorian and making micro kind of changes on the interior instead of actually thinking, how could a space that's designed that fits the kind of politics, the lifestyle agenda, and the way of living of this community help bolster it even more. So these were projects we produced for the Venice Biennial. And we have 5 projects here. I'm not going to present them all. I'm going to present them very quickly. But essentially, we modeled them through 2 scales of model: an organizational model that showed how the system came together, indexing in wood the private spaces and in concrete the shared spaces, and a zoomed-in model that showed what living might be. And these are typological studies, so they're actually not sited. There's not a community and there's not a physical site for them. We wanted to look at the arrangement of space and how this might suggest different forms of living. All of them are, say, grounded in a belief that repetition's not bad in housing, but is there a way to create diversity through repetition? And a belief that architecture needs to be in the background, that the architect's role is to organize life, but not define life. And by organizing in the background, allowing for a framework for people to reappropriate. So this first scheme is very simple. They're all very simple, I should say. This scheme is called grids. It actually just takes 2 differential grids at 2 different frequencies and overlays them on each other. So there's repetition of the things in the grid. The wider grid is a public program, material labor on one axis and domestic labor on the other axis, and the smaller grid is actually housing units. And while there's a repetition to the logic of each of those grids, because they're operating at different frequencies, you get a range of outdoor rooms of completely different scales and adjacencies that would be very different, so that every single unit in the building would feel entirely different. The second scheme is called rooms, as you can see by the floor plan. They're very simple titles to the schemes. And this essentially looks at the question of breaking apart co-living into individual rooms that reinscribes the street as the connective tissue, an interstitial space of a decentralized network. The third scheme is a field condition. It's called fields, and essentially we were looking at how a module of 4 units around a courtyard that share a courtyard might come together to produce different forms of subcollectives. And this was really piggybacking off what I was talking about, like sharing a bathroom with X number of people and sharing, a kitchen with many more. For instance, if you lived in the field, if you lived in, say you lived in this unit, you would exit one door to have a living room that you would share with these 3 people. You would exit another door to be in a dining space and another door to be in a kitchen with different people. So it's trying to actually kind of produce the sub-collectives at the scale of the unit itself. And then as the field opens it up, you get a bigger collective, where people from multiple modules would come together. And then in this final scheme, this was kind of an experimental scheme of asking, what if architecture just got out of the way? What if we actually thought more nimbly of this domestic space as built up of curtains and domestic objects that could be reconfigured at will by the communities themselves? And so this is probably the most fluid transition between the public and private realm, and a scheme that allows for multiple states to occur based on the wishes of the residents. And this is just the installation as it landed in Venice. Now, I'll show one final project very quickly in this last kind of topic here of what's called the articulated surface. I would say that the surface has become the primary organizational format of urbanism today. Cities like Houston or Atlanta are really organized through these infrastructural scripts, and they more or less are spread out into large managerial surfaces. And as the scale of the surface gets bigger, it also becomes more incomprehensible to the individual. Like, we drive down highways to try to make sense and create mental maps of how we live today. But this is also the case, at the scale of a building, right? Like, if we think about the surface at the scale of the building, when Mies made a free plan, or when Sana uses very simple surfaces with furniture configurations, they're really talking about the flexibility of something when architecture gets out of the way. And the flexibility comes through the management of that surface itself. In the 1960s, Super Studio had this project, which was called Super Surface 5, where they essentially depicted a surface that would run across the entire globe, connecting the flow of energy, matter, and information. And pretty much our reality today, it doesn't look as cool as this, as like a gridded thing, but it more or less is the reality that we live in today. And so we really want, and through these projects, we asked this question of what is the capacity of design to recenter the discussion of the management of the surface to choreography. What are the formal qualities that can be embedded into the surface that also retain its strategic, operational, and open-ended nature? Essentially, there's a tension always between genericness, like if you think of the Mies free plan, almost through the emptiness or the genericness of nothing being here. Maybe even this building, I don't know what the original building was, but I imagine its open-ended kind of factory-like large spans allowed for its reappropriation through its genericness. So there's something about that which is great, but it's also when it hits a certain scale, you can't place yourself anymore in the surface, that you've expanded beyond the scale of human comprehension. And so these projects are trying to actually articulate the surface while retaining the open-endedness of that genericness. So this is a project we did for the Chicago Biennial very recently, just in the last biennial. This was curated by David Brown, and David Brown's project for the last couple decades has been looking at all the available publicly owned sites in Chicago that are vacant. And there's, in his estimates, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 of these sites. And when we visited Chicago, these were not abstract. In fact, they were everywhere. And what's interesting when land becomes vacant, and it's something that's very abstract from where I'm living in the Bay Area, where land's very expensive, is that so many other amazing things can happen on land when it's not commodified into housing all the time. And there's a lot of things like that, like community land trusts and so forth that are being set up on these land. We wanted to think about this idea, that kind of Haight Street commune I showed you in the Bay Area, where there was a network of communes in close proximity. We wanted to take that further into a design project and ask, what if you took like a co-living house or a collective living house and broke it apart? So you just had a building that was dedicated to rooms, one that's just dedicated to like washrooms, one that's just dedicated, and you split these apart and inject them into a neighborhood to force the kind of going beyond the enclave nature of the commune. So there's kind of two major critiques of the commune. One is that they're enclaves, right? That you don't go into them, and when you do go into them, you feel like you're in a radical different world that you might not belong in. And it's always this question of self-selection, that people in communes tend to self-select people that feel familiar to them to ease day-to-day tensions. So these are not diverse places. They're like diverse as maybe a whole, because there's maybe a commune for different lifestyles, but individually they're typically not diverse. The second, so there's that kind of enclave nature. And the second one is, how does this scale up to be more of a widespread form of living that can challenge the other forms of housing that we have in our landscape? And the scaling up question might require us to think much more about networks of buildings and neighborhoods than individual insertions. So our proposal to the biennial curators was, what if we took this, based it on kind of time, and inserted into neighborhoods to actually use up these available sites. The neighborhood we were in was called Bronzeville. This is a neighborhood in the south side of Chicago, emblematic of the legacies of redlining, thousands of people living in precarity, whether through low income, high unemployment rates, or many people living alone that lack support systems. At the same time, Bronzeville has also taught us that through precarity, many forms of solidarity can emerge. Over the course of researching this project, we interviewed 30 mutual aid and solidarity organizations, and we're really inspired by the work that they were doing. Many of these organizations lack funding and time, as you can imagine, and are often unaware of like-minded groups, and it really makes scaling up their initiatives challenging. And so one of the things that we proposed to the curators, which is a kind of funny thing to propose for architects to an architectural biennial curator, was that we wanted to put together a directory, first of all, like interview and just map all the stuff going on in the neighborhood and make a resource for the neighborhood itself so they know what's going on. And as we did this, and this is kind of the large map we produced, we broke it down into a series of, say, different broadsheets based on different themes. And this was really inspired by like newspapers by the Cauliflower Commune or the Black Panthers that really tried to create a conversation between different commons that were happening. And these broadsheets break down into themes of food, ecology, care, and making. And our design intervention was actually to piggyback off the work that's already being done in the neighborhoods and to complement those themes with more programs linked to this idea of a larger, say, commune that's been disaggregated or decentralized into a series of sites. Now, each of these sites is bordered by kind of a loose framework of like a gridded wall. This could be a porous threshold that you could walk through. It could be infilled. It's something that gives legibility to the system that is kind of spread apart throughout the neighborhood. So when you see that wall, when you see that, you understand that's a part of a different form of land tenure. It's part of a different form of ownership than the rest of the sites around here. And so this produces, this was our neighborhood itself. This produces a series of speculative networks that move through the neighborhood. And I shouldn't say speculative in that these are very real sites and these are the empty sites. I mean speculative in that there's still a lot of work to do to get these groups together and kind of push the conversation forward. And it was interesting, while we worked on the project, in the neighborhood itself, on this abandoned schoolyard, Anthony Overton, this schoolyard's actually kind of working as a microcosm of what we're proposing. It's already a knowledge hub for various forms of installations and community-driven projects, many of which have been managed and curated by Borderless Studio, a firm in Chicago and Texas. And so we built one of these sites at one-to-one, you know, like an insertion that we could see in one of these sites, working with the people that run this school, asking them what their needs were. One of them was actually an educational space and a meeting space for the community. And we produced this very simple pavilion with this kind of gridded wall on the outside, made of curtains that would allow for different states to occur and different scales of assembly within those rooms to occur itself. And you can see that this, you know, that simple kind of gridding on the outside is something that we see being maybe the consistent thing that links those sites together and provides legibility. You know, in the introduction, there was a lot of talk about our drawings and the kind of idea of representation being something to draw out the way we see the world. And that representation starts in the drawings, but for us, and you probably saw it in a lot of these projects, there's questions around legibility. How do we actually see these issues in real life? Because it's obviously not hitting home when we read it on the news, you know? There's something about seeing things in physical space that resonate with us very different. And in a world that's increasingly despatialized and run through kind of, say, dubious news outlets, you know, the medium of the real, the medium of the physical, seeing power issues play themselves out and being indexed in space could be one of the most effective ways for us to bring these conversations front and center. So I'll end right there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Neeraj. That was truly an inspiring speech that you just made. I would like to open the floor for any questions that anyone has.
Thank you for being here, and I really appreciate the attention that you give to both beauty and substance. And I appreciate that you're being recognized for that by Institute and the people who are hosting this. In your Toledo project, you talked about the properties that were foreclosed on, and I feel like as architects, we're often confronted with addressing social justice or addressing climate justice, and they oftentimes don't work together. So sometimes it's a choice. And I'm just wondering, I feel like your workshop is trying to address both of those things, and what do you do when you're confronted with them not working in tandem?
Can you maybe explain a little bit more about the not working part in tandem, or like the choice that needs to be made?
Well, like a very simplified example is that affordable housing doesn't necessarily have the budget for resilient construction.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I don't know if I can fully answer that. I will say, like, we did a project called Resilient by Design. It's a project that's looking. It started in New York, and then it moved to the Bay Area, and there was 10 teams, and these were big teams. We were working with like AECOM and CMG landscape architects and so forth. There's like a team of maybe 20 people in the room, and the fascinating thing was when we were looking at flooding around the Bay Area due to sea level rise, the areas that are most vulnerable are obviously the ones along the waterfront, and those communities along the waterfront, at least in the Bay, are typically poor communities, and typically communities of color, because the history of the Bay, these were like industrial sites and many of the workers set up here, and this problem is really devastating because as the sea level rise comes up, the water table goes up, so essentially this is all brownfield sites, and that all those contaminants in the land will be leached out. And because of that, a levee is not effective. Like, you can't just levee off the bay because the water table will still go up. So already at the core, like when you zoom out just a little bit beyond the building and like the budget of a particular building, so many climate issues are social justice issues, because so much of our, the field of environmental racism, right? So much of the way that we've configured our cities have disproportionately affected certain communities to take the brunt of environmental decisions, and now that's coming to the foreground. So I don't know how to answer your question, because we've been there as well, confronted with these very tight budgets, and you're trying to do the most. But I will say that one of the things that frustrates me is when I see affordable housing in the Bay Area, the architects are doing everything they can to not make it look like affordable housing. Like, they're trying to make every window dance to disguise the repetition of the typology behind. They're using like 20 colors of materials to disguise the fact that it's an industrial-made process of this building. And there's a lack of sincerity to the fact that this is affordable housing, this kind of goes, frankly, to a lot of housing where there's typological repetition that is attempting to be covered up. And I think architects, we spend a lot of energy trying to hide the forces of the world and the power of the world and power structures of the world and normalize them for people. And if we took that money and that energy and actually just said, you know what, this is a typologically repetitive project with a low budget, and I'm okay to embrace that, you might have money left over for other things. And I think there's a trade-off here that I think we're so steeped in a kind of disciplinary need to make everything beautiful in a very small sliver of a definition of what beauty might entail, that we sometimes miss the big picture, that what we're often doing is actually instituting these power issues and making them palatable for people to digest. While we think we're making the world, a more beautiful place by doing so, it's I think like our, prioritization of budgets is a little bit skewed right now. And I don't think that fully answers your question, but I do think there's maybe a sincerity that the discipline needs to reckon with, that we're a discipline that's kind of operating through industrial processes, and that things get cheaper when they're repeated. We know that from every other thing that we own in the world. And I think there's a fear of that when it comes to housing. We don't have that fear with cars or laptops or phones. Like, we could all have the exact same phone, and we don't think that we're all the same person because of that. But we think that when it comes to housing, right? And that price that we pay for the individuation of housing and the expression of housing, there's a cost for that. There's a land use cost, and there's actually just a physical cost, and that's something that we need to reckon with. And I think there's just so many biases, unquestioned biases in the discipline itself, that are perpetuating these systemic issues. that aren't coming from a bad place. I think they're like unconsciously there. And if you just zoom out a little bit, you actually see like the discipline plays a big role in these issues. Like even the micro units I showed earlier, there's so many architects that are saying like, I'm saving the world because I'm producing an affordable alternative. But if you look at the value of those units, they're affordable for, maybe the first year or two, and then they also jump up. But what they've done in effect they've normalized and instituted a smaller way of living with fewer amenities and a tougher, harsher life for people, right? And so I think these are kind of the tricky things where sometimes even when we think we're solving a problem, if you just zoom out a bit, we're sometimes exacerbating it. And I think those trade-offs might just, ask us to put our own question about like, maybe it doesn't need to be beautiful in that way we want it to be, or we think it should be. Maybe we just need to accept the generic, repetitive quality of it and then redistribute those funds elsewhere. But I don't know, these are really complex issues, that we're gonna all have to confront in the next 20, 30 years.
Hi, so I will give you the caveat, I'm not an architect, I am a mathematician and I work in tech, so this is my sister drugged me here, she's studying landscape architecture, and this was...
Very intimidated now with the question that's gonna come.
But I want to say this was a very interesting talk because I'm used to just math equations, so I wrote my question to her and I had her approve it before I ask it, so I'm gonna ask it off
peer-reviewed question, okay.
So I read an article recently about how communities of color are largely affected, more so affected by, ones who are living in more affluent areas than cities, by climate change. And a lot of what you spoke about in that third section, especially when you started getting into Toledo and then the work that you were doing with the projects, it really brought me back to the article I was reading. So I wanted to ask a question about that. So excuse me as I read from my phone. How do you see the work that you discussed tonight, specifically to the work of the projects and collective living? How do you see that affecting communities of color with respect to climate change? In cities where communities of color are packed into small living spaces and are forced into cement landscapes, they are disproportionately see climate change more so than those with more green spaces. So how do you see affordable housing and community living play into that conversation of racial inequity with regard to climate change?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm glad you brought that up because it's sort of, if you look at the history of urban planning in America, it's deeply entrenched in redlining and co-locating communities of color against large-scale pollution. And this is something we're grappling with, not we as a firm, like we as a world are grappling with right now. I think there's something quite interesting. Like I was working in Bronzeville, which is a red line neighborhood, and still you feel the legacy of that today. It still hasn't caught up, right? This many years later, and it may never catch up per se. At the same time, there's this solidarity that's formed in the neighborhood, and there's something I'm kind of fascinated by when people don't have much, they take things into their own hands and actually produce things, and that's what we were really inspired by with the Bronzeville projects. And actually the Black Panthers is another example, like where I live in Oakland, where the Black Panthers, despite what the media perception of, the biggest legacy of the Black Panthers has been all the urban commons they set up and the social assistance programs they set up that even turned into the federal breakfast program. And so even at these kind of programs that are very grassroots kind of show an effect of scaling up something really big. And we did another project recently in West Oakland where the Black Panthers formed, looking at aging and co-living, like aging in terms of elderly people and how to produce support systems. And I think the issue for me around collective living is in fact the thing I presented at first, and maybe I'm guilty, is showing like hippies in a park in a commune makes everyone feel like, oh God, that's not for me. And then also if you go visit some collective living projects, because they're hyper-specific to a particular way of life, if it doesn't agree with the way you want to live your life, you're just like, I'm out of here, right? And like, that makes sense. But I know from the projects we've analyzed, there's many different types of lifestyles that can occur within these, and many different age brackets, right? And so there was a gentleman that set up a collective living project in the Bay. He eventually met his love in that project 10 years later, They had twins, and he quickly realized, like, okay, I love this community, I established it, but it's not conducive to raising kids here. And he bought a house with 4 other couples that all had kids, and they kind of set up a micro co-living thing at the scale of a house, realizing that what their needs were at that moment of life, just change. And you could say the same thing with the elderly as well. There's very few support systems for many people living alone, particularly the boomer generation are very resistant to leave their homes. And so I think there's, for me, there's like collective living could be for everyone. I frankly think there's many different lifestyles that could be formed in it. But what collective living forces, it forces politics into everyday life. That we could think of politics as like, who do you vote for every 4 years? Like that's one form of politics. But in the end, our politics are really the aggregation of a lot of micro decisions that are made on the day-to-day, like, did you Uber here, or did you take the bus? Did you pack your lunch, or did you buy it? Did you, who are you hanging out with after work? Like, all of those micro decisions, like, where did you go grocery shopping? When you add them up, the sum total speak to a particular value set and a particular lifestyle, which is your politics, right? And for me, the kind of idea of collective living is that politics is confronted every day, that you have to actually negotiate your everyday politics with other people, and by doing so, it's the only way to clarify what you actually really value. Like, you might really think you value something until you're confronted with other people and you're forced to articulate what you really value. And I think that's, like, we live in a world right now where many people are very apolitical, just looking at how much people vote and so forth. But this isn't to say that they don't have politics or ideas about how they live their life, but many of those ideas may not actually be about how they're living, but how they think they're living or how they want to live, right? But collective living is about how you're living right now. It's not how you want to live or how you've been socialized to thinking you should live. It's what you're actually doing in the moment. And I think because of that, when you bring politics to one's front door, it's not an abstract thing in the background. It's a continual negotiation that we need to play out. And so I think communities of color, there's actually many collective living projects for communities of color. The overlap between communities of color and the environmental issues that we're going to face is a really, really complicated subject, and it's not going to be, I can tell you one thing, I have very few hopes that this will be reconciled through the market. I just don't think the logic of the market can solve a problem like that. I think it's going to have to be reconciled through large-scale reparations and ideas around reparations. And in California, they've set up a commission now to study this. In Canada, where I'm from, there's a lot of discussion and ceding of land back to the First Nations and Indigenous. And so I think this was going to have to be a big part of the conversation, and it might mean the relocation of people. And when I said that, we don't place the same pressure on our phones and our laptops as we do on our housing to express ourselves. The other side of that is, like, we're very resistant to leave our housing, right? Like in many communities in the world that are undergoing floods year after year, people move like a few miles up the street to higher lands. We don't really do that in the States, right? We like when Houston gets flooded, there's someone interviewing someone being flooded on the news, and they're saying they're rebuilding their house in the exact same location. Part of that's because of issues of how that FEMA money is distributed and they need to rebuild in that same location. Part of it is like we feel like it's our right to be rooted in the ground, like where we want to be. And that's a cultural issue that's going to have to shift, because the easiest way to deal with some of the largest effects of climate change is to relocate, for us to like move to different geographies that are more suitable for living in. It's like the elephant in the room, right? That no one wants to talk about because it's such a controversial topic to ask people to leave where they live.
Thank you so much. What a great discussion so far. We have room for one more question at this time. Oh my gosh. These are going to give me options.
I wrote mine down because I want to sound intelligent. I've been to Israel, and so having seen how kibbutzes can work in Israel, do you think that the American identity or selfishness will hamper collective living, because like you just said, so much of who we are is tied up into our homes, or our subway tile backsplash that we see on HDTV. But yet knowing that like dorms can work, like being in college, when I was in college, we had suite hallways. Well, now no one wants to be in no one wants to share a bathroom with 30 people. And so it's like we keep pulling away from collective lifestyles as a society. Do you think that'll shift? Because it can work.
I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't answer that really. But I can tell you that like what you're describing is like nurture, not nature, right? Like we've equated wealth generation in America to the idea of privacy, right? That the more wealth you have, the more you can escape other people. And if you think about some of the wealthiest people, they create compounds and bring the world to them so they don't have to interact with other people, right? And so I think that link between wealth and privacy is something that needs to be challenged. Frankly, you just have a lot of people in this country living alone, right? It's not like the nuclear family's the minority, right? Like more and more people are living alone. And they don't have support systems in old age. They suffer from loneliness, depression, anxiety, like most people after COVID. And I think those things will have to be questioned for the sake of society, because I don't know exactly how you build a society where everyone kind of goes into their own individual corner and does their own thing when we're dealing with a global issue like climate change, for instance. Like that issue is not going away. And we're still in the denial phase, right? That's happening. Like, even despite everything that's going on in the news every single day, we're still in the denial phase, despite all the, scientists and the reports. We've sort of numbed ourselves to that because we can't conceive of a way that we can work our way out of climate change within capitalism itself. And we know that to deal with it requires a large-scale restructuring of a lot of systems, which is kind of terrifying, right? It's going to be a lot of economic volatility, political volatility. There will be things that we'll have to confront in our lifetime that deal with the world in front of us, not the world behind us. And I think part of that is going to have to be a culture where people work together, because we are in it together. That's at the end of the day. It doesn't matter if you have an estate. Climate change is still going to hit you. The air is still the air, and maybe a few people can get in their rocket ships and go somewhere, but like for the most of us, we're going to be here, and we're going to have to learn that. And I think the pandemic might have been like some form of training, right? Of what does a global issue mean? And do we need certain scales of global governance to deal with supply chains to ensure that there's movement and equitable distribution of things in the world? And looking back on the pandemic, it wasn't like we scored very well on a report card. Like as a world, there's like a lot of people lost their lives. A lot of people are suffering from deep mental health issues, but also just a lot of people in the world are not vaccinated, and there's not going to be any time soon that they will be vaccinated, right? And I think that question of like that for me is like climate change, right? Like you can't just vaccinate the wealthy countries. That thing's going to mutate somewhere else and come right back here, right? So, just the short-sightedness of that and the individualization of that, of like, we're fine, is kind of like what climate change is about too, right? That we can't like build a levee that just protects us. The air quality itself will, get to us anywhere. And I can tell you that from California, because we have, multiple days a year now that we can't go outside, and you really have to mask up because of the wildfires. It's really in your face, the kind of, I think it's in your face everywhere, that you go these days. I know, Zach, you did have a question. I can, if they have energy.
I guess we can push the
I felt
rules.
bad that you got overlooked.
I promise mine will be fast.
Maybe you could end on a lighter note, too. I feel like this has gotten a little dark on these questions.
I'll do my best. So we've been trying to come up with what-if statements for our city this week, and I was really kind of taken by the Toledo project in that you entered a competition about how can you redesign or redefine the waterfront and you started, instead of kind of drawing and sketching and planning about what's happening on land, you started by looking at the river. And so you started by trying to understand the factors that are affecting the waterfront rather than looking at the waterfront itself. So in terms of how we're tackling problems in our city, unfortunately we don't have a river, but in terms of how we're attacking problems in our city, how do you start? How do you start to build that framework and do research and look beyond the things that are readily available and understand the systems that are at play or that are affecting the kind of localized issue?
Yeah, I guess the starting point is, just reading a lot and not reading architecture solely, right? Like just reading about, like reading architectural theory versus like reading The Economist or, like a journal or, the New York Times every day. I think it kind of situates where the discipline's at, right? And I think many architects, we have a harsh profession. There's not much time to do anything else but architecture when you're an architect. And I think architects are fairly well read, but I think like there's oftentimes so much deep-seated belief in the discipline, that comes with like nighttime complaining about it when you over drinks, but like at its core, when you wake up in the morning, like deep-seated belief in the discipline, that we sometimes, lose sight of where the agency might lie, and that agency is not solely aesthetic. And so I think like one of the starting points, and that's why I teach, is that I think the way we teach students is fundamentally very skewed. Like we still, on every final review, I maybe sit on 5 to 10 juries a year in different parts of the country. The aesthetics of the project and the aesthetics of the drawing are still 90% of what's discussed. And until we as professors and the way we educate people can go beyond that to talk about, what's happening in the projects, of course the system's going to perpetuate itself, right? And we're guilty of it too. Like we use beautiful drawings as a way to bring people into the conversation. It's like it's a very subversive act, right? That these drawings are made to seduce people into a conversation. But the forms themselves are not seductive, like, just to self-critique. Like they're not really meant to be seductive. They're typically quite generic and very simple architectural forms. The drawings are much more seductive than the forms themselves. And that's very purposeful, right? So the kind of the agency of the representation is a tool of advocacy and drawing people into a project. In terms of like where we start with the research, we usually do exactly what you're doing in this workshop. We have like a week of like very widespread research of we'll try to kind of hold our biases at the door, and different people on the team will just research different themes. We kind of run like an academic atelier, right? That like everyone presents what they're researching every day, kind of learn from each other, do another round of it, and until we kind of land on stuff. And I guess during that process of research, trying to figure out what are the forms of things that are coming up that are issues that the discipline might have a role in. And because there's a lot of fascinating things once you start researching. And so in that way, I guess like we're almost doing research like we're kind of sifting through, looking for the needle in the haystack, or being kind of spatial detectives, trying to actually unpack where the agency of design might play a role in these kind of conversations. And I don't mean like the design of a building per se, but just the agency of design as a whole might have an impact. And that's probably the biggest thing that helps edit that research down, of going, okay, this is a great thing, but this is something that is in the world of planning policy and not architecture per se, or this is a great idea, but I don't know how we do that project from a distance on this competition, because it would require us working with community groups for 2-3 years to make it work. And that's where there's loopholes, right? Like in the Dredge project, we designed a system, but we leave the openness of the island to anyone on the ground having designed the system. And that was kind of like a loophole because we weren't in Toledo and we were doing this competition from a distance, and we didn't have the luxury of like working with community groups and really understanding their impacts. So we said, we kind of made it an ideological choice to say, could we design a system where people then could design for themselves what they want? And so it kind of changes from project to project, but I think it's like widespread research and then looking for where architecture might have a role or something to say or to that research.
Thank you so much. We should all give a hand to Neeraj.